On the 16th of February, 1942, a few minutes before midday, 22 women linked arms on a beach in the Dutch East Indies and walked into the sea because the men standing behind them had ordered it. They were Australian Army nurses. They were wearing grey uniform dresses and Red Cross armbands. And for 2 days they had been caring for stretcher cases under a shelter they had marked so that anyone approaching would understand exactly what they were. When the water reached their knees, the machine gun opened up behind them. 21 of them died. 1 did not. A bullet passed clean through Vivian Bullwinkel and missed every organ it could have taken, and she lay face down in the surf until the soldiers had gone. She then spent 3.5 years as a prisoner of the army that had shot her, hiding the wound, because being identified as the only witness meant execution. When the war ended, she gave her government a sworn statement describing everything that had been done to those women. Her government read it and ordered her never to speak of it. She obeyed for 54 years. Tell me in the comments, had you heard the name Vivian Bullwinkel before today? Because the massacre is not the part of this story that was buried. Now let us go. To understand how 22 Australian women came to be standing in the surf off an Indonesian island, you must first understand what had happened 800 kilometres to the north and how fast it happened. The Australian 8th Division had been sent to Malaya on the 2nd of February, 1941, to garrison what was then understood to be the anchor of British power in Southeast Asia. Singapore was a fortress in the way that a reputation is a fortress. The naval base was real, the guns were real, and the strategic assumption underneath all of it was that any serious threat would arrive from the sea, in daylight, in a form the Royal Navy could meet. The Japanese landed at Kota Baru on the northeastern coast of the Malay Peninsula at dawn on the 8th of December, 1941, roughly an hour before their aircraft reached Pearl Harbor. They came overland, through jungle the defenders had been assured was impassable, and they did not stop. What made the collapse so complete was not the absence of force, but the presence of an assumption. Every calculation about how long Singapore could hold was a calculation about a different battle, and once that became apparent, there was nothing behind it. By the 3rd of February, 1942, the 8th Division had been pushed back across the causeway onto the island itself, and the Japanese, who had covered the length of the peninsula in under 2 months against a defence built facing the wrong way, landed on the night of the 8th of February. The people who suffered most immediately from the discovery were the ones furthest from the decision, which in a modern army means the medical services and the civilians. The hospitals moved backwards with the retreat, which is a sentence that conceals an enormous amount of work. The 213th Australian General Hospital was forced out of Tampoy, near Johor Bahru, and reassembled itself inside St. Patrick's College in Singapore. Under matron Olive Pashka, the 210th Australian General Hospital had already converted a school into a 200-bed facility, and then absorbed the buildings around it, until the unit was treating as many as 600 patients at a time. Hospitals were being improvised out of private houses. The nurses of the Australian Army Nursing Service, who had spent the previous year dealing with training accidents and malaria, were working through casualties arriving faster than beds could be emptied, in a city being shelled, with the front line moving towards them at a rate nobody in the chain of command had planned for. There is one further piece of information that belongs here, and it is the piece that makes everything afterwards difficult to read. In December 1941, during the fall of Hong Kong, Japanese troops of the 229th Infantry Regiment raped and murdered British and Chinese nurses. The atrocity was documented, and British intelligence identified the unit responsible. The military historian Lynette Ramsay Silver has argued that senior Australian officers were aware of what had been done at Hong Kong, and that they were nonetheless slow in pressing for the evacuation of the Australian nurses from Singapore. That claim is an inference rather than an archival finding, and it should be weighed as one. What is not in dispute is the identity of the regiment, or where it was, 8 weeks later. On the 10th of February, the nurses were ordered to prepare to leave. On the evening of the 15th, Lieutenant General Arthur Percival ordered his forces to cease hostilities at 8:30, and approximately 130,000 Commonwealth troops passed into Japanese captivity, 15,000 of them Australian. It remains the largest surrender in British military history. By then, the last of the nurses had been at sea for 3 days, and 2 of them were already dead. More than 3,400 Australian women served with the Australian Army Nursing Service during the Second World War, and until the 23rd of March, 1943, not one of them held a military rank. They were sisters and matrons, which are hospital titles. They wore uniform, they were subject to military discipline, they served in operational theatres alongside the infantry they were treating, and the army that deployed them had never got round to commissioning them properly. The women who walked into the sea at Radji Beach did so as civilians in everything except obligation. Vivian Bullwinkel was born at Kapunda in South Australia on the 18th of December 1915, the elder child of a timekeeper, and she grew up at Broken Hill. She was captain of Broken Hill High School in 1933, played basketball, tennis and vigoro, and trained as a nurse at the Broken Hill and District Hospital between 1934 and 1938, qualifying in midwifery the year after. Her friends called her Bully. When the war came, she volunteered for the Royal Australian Air Force and was rejected on the grounds that she had flat feet. She joined the Australian Army Nursing Service instead in May 1941 and sailed for Singapore that September, arriving aged 25. She would be 26 on the beach. Matron Irene Melville Drummond was born at Ashfield in New South Wales on the 26th of July, 1905. She was educated at Catholic schools in Adelaide and Broken Hill, trained at a private hospital in Adelaide, qualified in obstetrics, and in 1933 took up a position at the Broken Hill and District Hospital, where she served as surgical sister, assistant matron and acting matron before enlisting in July 1940. She and Bullwinkel had trained in the same building. Matron Olive Pashka, born at Dimboola in Victoria in the same year as Drummond, was the senior Australian nurse in Malaya and had been awarded the Royal Red Cross in January 1942. She drowned 6 weeks later. What those women were doing in the weeks before they were put on the ships deserves stating, because the popular version of this story tends to begin at the moment they became victims. They were running surgical wards in buildings that had been schools a fortnight earlier, working through air raids in a city with failing power and failing water, and receiving casualties from a front line that moved closer every day, in numbers that meant triage, which is a clinical word for deciding which of the men in front of you will be treated and which will not. Among them were women who had already been decorated. They were, by any measure that matters, an experienced professional formation doing skilled work under fire. That is who was put on the ships. On the 11th of February, 1942, with the Japanese on the island and the city 4 days from surrender, Matron Drummond assembled the nurses of the 213th Australian General Hospital and called for volunteers for immediate evacuation. Not one nurse stepped forward. Matron Pashka put the same question to the nurses of the 210th, and Sister Kathleen Kinsler put it to the members of the 4th Casualty Clearing Station. And in all 3 units, the answer was identical. Nobody moved because moving meant leaving patients behind, and the women in those rooms had reached the same conclusion independently and without discussion. The matrons were therefore required to select who left, which is the same thing as selecting who stayed. Pashka and Drummond both chose to go with the last group. Nobody volunteered, so they were ordered. On the 10th of February, 6 members of the nursing service embarked on the WWII alongside 120 sick and wounded men. The following day, 59 nurses boarded the Empire Star. On the evening of the 12th, 65 sailed in the Vyner Brooke. 130 nurses in 3 ships. Nothing organised left Singapore after them. 2 of those ships got through. The Empire Star, which had accommodation for 16 passengers, carried more than 2,100 people out of the harbour and was strafed from the air on the way to Batavia, and Sisters Margaret Anderson and Vera Tawney lay across their patients, with their own bodies to shield them, for which Anderson received the George Medal. The ship reached Fremantle with everyone aboard alive. Getting out was possible. The Vyner Brooke had been built at Leith in Scotland in 1928, a vessel of 1,670 tons capable of 12 knots, named for Sir Charles Vyner Brooke, the third and last White Rajah of Sarawak. She had spent her working life running between Kuching and Singapore, and she was, in effect, a royal yacht. The Royal Navy requisitioned her as an armed trader. She was painted grey and given a 4-inch gun forward, 2 Lewis guns aft, and a rack of depth charges, and commissioned as His Majesty's ship Vyner Brooke, which turned a small elderly island steamer into a warship in the same way that a coat of paint turns anything into anything. Her peacetime master, Captain Richard Borton, was asked to remain in command, and did. Part of her crew was made up of survivors of the Prince of Wales and the Repulse, men who had already been sunk once inside the preceding 2 months. They went back out. Her normal complement was 12 passengers and 47 crew. When she cleared Singapore on the evening of the 12th of February, she had at least 181 passengers aboard, and some estimates put the figure above 300. That range is not the result of poor record-keeping by anyone in particular. It is the result of a port in which nobody was counting anymore. The ship carrying the last Australian nurses out of the city sailed without an accurate record of who was aboard it, and nobody has ever been able to construct one. Bullwinkel's diary for the 10th of February records that, on her last night in Singapore, she sat and had champagne on the veranda of the villa where the nurses were quartered, and that the shelling made sleep impossible. That is the final entry in a diary she had kept faithfully since the previous August. Everything after it comes from sworn evidence. Through the daylight hours of the 13th, the Vyner Brooke lay up in the lee of a small jungle-covered island, hiding. She was found late in the afternoon by a single Japanese aircraft and attacked without serious casualties, and at sunset, with the light going, she made her run for the Bangka Strait and Palembang beyond it, while Japanese warships prowling the approaches slowed her through the night. Daylight on the 14th of February found her inside the strait, in the open, on a flat sea. There was no chop to break up her outline, no cloud, no darkness left, and no speed available to a ship that could manage 12 knots on a good day. Every condition a bomber requires was present at once. They came a little after 1 o'clock in the afternoon, 9 of them, and Borton put the helm over and began zigzagging, which is what the master of an unarmoured island steamer does when he has nothing else available to him. She was hit 3 times. The bridge was destroyed. The steering gear failed, and fire took hold. As the bombs were falling, the nurses were below treating the wounded, and when the order came to abandon ship, they went over the side after their patients rather than before them. She rolled over and sank bow first in a little over 20 minutes. The Vyner Brooke was one of approximately 40 ships sunk by Japanese aircraft in and around the Bangka Strait that day. This was not a singular catastrophe. It was one afternoon of a slaughter being conducted across the whole southern approach, and the people in the water off Bangka Island belonged to a much larger number. Nobody has ever finished counting it. Survivors were in the sea for between 8 and 65 hours. One raft held a nurse, a radio operator, 2 British sailors, one of whom was badly burned, and later 3 civilian women, and those who had the strength took turns swimming alongside it and holding onto the ropes. One of the civilian women lost consciousness, and drifted away and was not seen again. And during the night, the burned sailor slipped off the raft, and the people still holding onto it were too weak to pull him back. Sister Winnie Davis and Sister Pat Gunther, both strong swimmers, came within sight of the shore several times and were carried out again by the tide, and were finally taken out of the water by a Japanese ship and held overnight in a pig pen. Captain Borton was in the sea for 18 hours before he made landfall near the Muntok Lighthouse. 12 of the 65 nurses died in the attack or drowned afterwards. Kathleen Kinsella, Eleanor Calnan, Lavinia Russell, Marjorie Schumann, Mona Wilton, Olive Pashka, Annie Trineri, Caroline Ennis, Luvima Bates, Mary Clark, Gladys MacDonald, Hulda Dorsch. The senior Australian nurse in Malaya, decorated 6 weeks earlier, who had chosen to leave on the last ship, is the 6th name on that list. Nothing in the record distinguishes her death from any of the others. Roughly 150 people reached Bangka Island alive, and they did not reach it together. They came ashore over 2 days at scattered points along the coast, in ones and twos and small exhausted groups, and most were picked up within hours by the Japanese garrison already holding the island. 31 Australian nurses came ashore, somewhere other than Radji Beach, and went directly into captivity. They matter enormously to what follows, and for the next 2 days, they are simply gone. The beach itself lies a short distance to the northwest of the town of Muntok. Jungle runs down almost to the sand. At one end, there is a rocky headland, and around the far side of that headland, there is a cove, and the significance of that geography is not scenic. It meant that anything done on one side of the headland could not be seen from the other. The ground on which those people had been deposited by the tide was, without anybody choosing it, ideally configured for what was about to be done there. That much was chance. Nothing that followed was. 22 Australian nurses had gathered at Radji Beach, along with civilian women and children off the Vyner Brooke. And on the following day, they were joined by as many as 60 Commonwealth servicemen and merchant sailors who had come ashore from other vessels sunk in the same waters. About 100 people in total. They built a fire on the sand and discussed what could be done, and the answer they arrived at was that nothing could. The island was already occupied. An approach to a nearby village for food came back with nothing, because the villagers understood the situation better than the shipwrecked people did, and were frightened. There were wounded who could not be moved, and there was no way off. They agreed to surrender, and an officer of the Vyner Brooke set out on foot for Muntok to arrange it. While he was gone, Matron Drummond made the last command decision of her life. She argued that the civilian women and children should not sit on the beach waiting for the Japanese to arrive, and that they should start walking towards Muntok immediately and hand themselves in there. She persuaded them. All of them went, except one British civilian woman who chose to stay. Every single person who walked away from Radji Beach that morning survived the day. The nurses stayed because there were stretcher cases on the sand who could not walk, and it did not occur to any of them to leave. They put up a shelter for the wounded and marked it with a large red cross. They were wearing their grey uniform dresses and their Red Cross armbands. Under the laws of war, they were a protected class, and they had gone to deliberate trouble to make that visible from a distance to anyone approaching along that beach. They expected it to mean something. At mid-morning on the 16th of February, 1942, the ship's officer came back down the beach with about 20 Japanese soldiers walking behind him. The soldiers separated the men from the women. The wounded who could walk were ordered around the headland, and they were taken in 2 groups. Machine guns were set up in the cove. Stoker Ernest Lloyd of the Royal Navy, who had survived the sinking of the Prince of Wales in December and had now been shipwrecked twice in 9 weeks, understood what was happening and ran into the sea, and a few men went with him. The Japanese fired on them as they ran. Everyone in that group was killed except Lloyd, who was hit, kept going, lost consciousness in the water, and washed ashore further along the coast. The second group was taken around the headland afterwards. Approximately 60 men died behind that rock. 2 survived the day: Lloyd and an American named Eric German. The women on the other side of the headland heard a rapid succession of shots, and some time afterwards the soldiers came back onto the beach, sat down on the sand in front of the nurses, and cleaned their bayonets and their rifles. Every account of that morning contains this detail. What happened during the interval between the killing of the men and the killing of the women is the reason this story is worth telling at length, and it is not going to be dealt with here. It will be set out later, in the place where the evidence for it can be presented properly, and where the question of who knew it and who suppressed it can be answered. It was not recorded at the time. That absence was not an oversight, and the shape of this story is the shape of that absence, so this account will keep it exactly where the record kept it, and come back for it. A little before midday, the nurses were ordered to their feet. 22 Australian Army nurses and 1 British civilian woman formed a line at the water's edge, facing out to sea, with the soldiers and the machine gun behind them. They linked arms. Then they walked in. Bullwinkel reported afterwards that as they moved through the water, Matron Drummond called out to them. The words she recorded were these: "Chin up, girls. I am proud of you, and I love you all." Another nurse said, dryly, that there were 2 things she hated in life: the Japanese and the sea, and today she had got both. Bullwinkel said she saw no tears and no sign of despair from any of them. It should be said now, rather than later, that the reliability of the first of those quotations has been seriously questioned in recent years, and that question is addressed further on. The second one has never been doubted by anybody. When the water was somewhere between their knees and their waists, the machine gun opened fire from behind them. 21 Australian nurses and the British civilian woman were killed. Bullwinkel was standing towards the end of the line. The bullet struck her at the waist and passed straight through. It touched nothing that would have killed her. Her own account of the next few minutes, given under oath, is this: the force of the bullet knocked her over into the water, where she stayed for a few seconds, and then, being more or less too frightened to get up again, she stayed lying there, and the waves washed her back to the sand, where she remained lying for another 10 minutes. All was quiet. Then she got up. The Japanese had all disappeared. The wounded men who had been left on stretchers on the beach, who could not be marched anywhere, and who had been lying there throughout, were bayoneted where they lay. One more thing needs to be said about that line of women before we leave the beach. 21 of them were Australian Army nurses, and their names are known, and they will be read out before the end of this account. The 22nd was a British civilian who had chosen not to walk to Montauk with the others, who stayed with the nurses, and who died in the same line, in the same water, in the same burst of fire. Her name does not appear in any accessible record. Nobody wrote it down. In her evidence to the tribunal in Tokyo, nearly 5 years later, Bullwinkel described what she did next in a single sentence. She got up, went into the jungle, lay down and either slept or was unconscious for a couple of days. She was 26 years old. She had a hole through her midsection. She had just watched every colleague she had in the world be shot in the back, and she walked into the trees and lost consciousness. The record contains nothing else about it. When she came round, she found a British soldier in the undergrowth. Private Cecil Kinsley of the Royal Army Ordnance Corps had been bayoneted in the abdomen and the shoulder, and left for dead with the other men, and had crawled away. He was in a far worse condition than she was. She dressed his wounds before she dressed her own. She did not establish the full extent of her own injury until considerably later, because she did not look. There is no commentary that improves that sentence, and none will be offered. They stayed hidden for 12 days. She bathed his wounds and went out looking for food, and local villagers fed them both, which was an act taken in the full knowledge of what the Japanese did to people who helped Europeans. Lloyd, who had washed up alive further down the coast, eventually found them, and the three of them worked through the arithmetic of their position, which was not complicated and did not take long. 2 of them were badly wounded, none of them could travel. The food was coming from people who were risking execution to provide it, and there was nowhere on the island to go. On the 28th of February, 1942, Bullwinkel and Kinsley walked into Muntok and surrendered. Kinsley, who had survived a bayonet through the abdomen and 12 days in the jungle, died shortly afterwards, without ever receiving proper medical care. The villagers who had fed them abandoned their village, because they expected reprisals, and after the war, the Australian government rewarded the family who had sheltered them. That is the entire recorded consequence of the affair, on either side of it. As for the beach, the people of Bangka Island have their own name for it. They call it English Bay, on account of the Europeans who were killed there. For years afterwards, fragments of bone washed up on the sand, and the local people would not eat fish taken from that water. She was now a prisoner of the regiment that had shot her, which is a sentence worth sitting with, because for the next 3.5 years it was the operative fact of her existence. At Muntok, she was reunited with the 31 surviving Australian nurses who had come ashore elsewhere, and she told them what had happened at Radji Beach. Then all 32 of them made a decision. Nobody would ever mention it again while they remained in captivity, because if the Japanese established that there was a living witness, they would remove her. Bullwinkel wore a water bottle slung on her hip to cover the entry wound. 31 women held that secret for 3.5 years, through starvation, through malaria and dysentery and beriberi, through 4 camps and the deaths of 8 of their own. Not one of them let it slip. She did tell one other person, and the decision to do so is among the most consequential things in this story. In the coolie lines at Muntok, she gave a full account of the massacre to Major William Alston Tebbit, an Australian officer, specifically so that it would be documented by somebody in an official capacity. She was 26, she was a prisoner, she had every reason to assume she would not survive, and her priority was the record. Tebbit was subsequently moved to Japanese military prisons, but he kept track of the fact that 32 Australian nurses had entered the camp system, and when the war ended, he spent months pressing the Australian government to keep looking for them. He was right to. The camps ran in a sequence, each one worse than the last. First the jail at Muntok, where, as Betty Jeffrey recorded, they learned to sleep on unadulterated concrete and eat filthy rice, and where the lavatory was a gutter with no protection and no privacy, used by prisoners and guards alike. Jeffrey was a nurse of the 2 10th Australian General Hospital who had also survived the Vyner Brooke, and she would become Bullwinkel's closest friend, and, in time, the person who told this story to Australia. After a fortnight, the women were shipped to Sumatra and up the river to Palembang, where they were paraded through the town in what the male internees called the Gloat Parade. In December 1943, they were moved into Palembang jail, and the administration passed from civilian to military hands, at which point conditions deteriorated sharply, and in October 1944, they were shipped back across the strait to Muntok, into an intensely malarial area, on worse rations, with almost no medicine, and with 2.5 years of accumulated malnutrition behind them. The Japanese attempted at one point to persuade the nurses to staff a brothel. They refused, and the matter was not pursued. By the Muntok period, the strongest of the women were digging 2 or 3 graves a day, and that work came on top of the carrying, which meant taking the buckets of lavatory refuse out into the jungle. The move in April 1945 was made in the hold of what one of them called a bumping little launch, 26 hours across open water, with women unconscious on stretchers carried aboard by whoever was still capable of lifting. At Lobok Lingau, more than 500 women and children were put into leaking huts of bamboo and palm leaf, and every litre of water had to be fetched from a creek. They ate grass from the creek bank and the young curling fronds of ferns. Jeffrey wrote that curried fern with sweet potato was exactly like eating mushrooms. And the reason to quote that line is not the recipe. It is that she was still making jokes. The Australians were worse off than most of the women held with them. The Dutch internees, taken in the territory where they lived, generally had money, possessions, and local contacts, and could buy food to supplement a diet of low-grade rice. The Australians had what they had been wearing when their ship went down. They also made things. In the Palembang camp, the women produced an embroidery of a eucalypt and the Australian landscape behind it, worked entirely in threads they had pulled out of their own clothing, and it is now held by the Australian War Memorial. A silver jam spoon and a pair of eyebrow tweezers were kept and treasured as what one internee described as the last vestiges of a civilized world. A British missionary teacher named Margaret Dryburgh, who had been interned with them and who was the eldest woman in the camp, helped create what the internees called their vocal orchestra, in which the women sang the parts of instruments they did not have. Dryburgh died in captivity at the age of 54. Human beings under sustained extreme pressure will manufacture normality out of whatever happens to be within reach, and there is no more exact illustration of it available anywhere than a group of women unpicking their own dresses to sew a picture of home, and another singing a symphony they had no means of playing. They were starving throughout. 8 of the nurses did not come out. Wilhelmina Raymond died at Montauk on the 8th of February, 1945. Irene Singleton died on the 20th, and on the day she died, she kept asking for more breakfast. Blanche Hempstead, who had worked herself past the point her body could sustain, apologized for the trouble her illness had caused, and then apologized for taking so long to die. Dora Gardam died on the 4th of April. Winnie Davis, the strong swimmer who had been pulled out of the Bangka Strait, died at Belalau on the 19th of July, at the age of 30. Rubina Freeman died on the 8th of August. Pearl Mittelhäuser died on the 18th of August, 1945, 3 days after the Japanese surrender, which nobody in that camp had yet been told about. The only thing she had wanted was to hear her own people call her by her first name. When the first of the nurses died, in February 1945, the others gave her a military funeral. One of them noted with satisfaction that it made the Japanese sit up. On the 23rd of March, 1943, the Australian Army finally granted military rank to the nurses of the Australian Army Nursing Service, including those in Japanese hands. Bullwinkel's nursing rank of sister became the rank of lieutenant. She was commissioned in absentia, inside a prison camp, by the institution that had not managed to get her out of Singapore. The war ended on the 15th of August, 1945, and nobody in the Allied command structure knew where the Australian nurses were. That was deliberate. The Japanese denied any knowledge of surviving Australian nurses and concealed the existence of the camp at the Belalau rubber plantation, roughly 15 kilometres outside Lubuk Lingau, because they wanted an opportunity to improve the women's physical condition before anybody from the outside saw them. The consequence was that the camp received none of the emergency airdrops of food and medicine made to prison camps across Southeast Asia in the last 2 weeks of August. The women who had been starved for 3.5 years were now being starved for a further reason, so that nobody would see what the starving had done to them. On the 24th of August, Captain Seki Kazue assembled the internees. They believed they were about to be killed. He climbed onto a table and told them that the war was over and that now they could be friends. He did not tell them who had won. 4 men are responsible for the fact that anybody found them. Major Tebbit kept pressing Canberra from outside. Stoker Lloyd, liberated from his own camp, told the authorities that there had been Australian nurses and refused to let the matter drop, and kept looking himself. Major Gideon Jacobs, a South African who had parachuted into Sumatra to take charge of the camps, and to make certain the Japanese did not kill the prisoners before they could be handed over, worked out in early September that he was being lied to about the location of a camp. The Australian war correspondent Hayden Leonard followed a chain of leads from local villagers until he arrived at the gate. At the airstrip at Lahat, Colonel Annie Sage, Matron-in-Chief of the Australian Army Nursing Service, climbed out of the aircraft expecting to collect a large party. She looked at the small, emaciated group of women standing in front of her and asked them where the rest of them were. Major Harry Windsor, the Australian Army doctor who had flown in with the rescue team, was so appalled by the condition of the survivors that he formally recommended, in an official report, that the guards, the Kempitai, and everyone else involved in the treatment of those prisoners be slowly and painfully butchered. The historian who found that report in the archives half a century later had known Windsor personally in later life, and described him as a man in whom such words were entirely inconceivable. He wrote them anyway. They were flown out on the 16th of September, 1945, sailed for home on the 4th of October, and reached Fremantle in the hospital ship Manunda on the 23rd. Matron Eileen Joubert of the military hospital in Perth had gone on local radio and asked the public for flowers to brighten the wards, and the response covered the entire forecourt of the hospital. Blooms carried in from hundreds of kilometres away and wheeled in from down the road in barrows. Bullwinkel summarised the transition herself. One night sleeping with bugs, the next almost like princesses. 24 of the 65 nurses who had sailed from Singapore came home. News that one Australian nurse had survived a massacre on Bangka Island reached the newspapers within days of the liberation, and by the time she was repatriated in October, she was a national figure who had never given an interview. Crowds turned out to cheer the nurses through Melbourne. She was given a civic reception at the Broken Hill Town Hall in January 1946, and the nurses of the hospital where she had trained formed a guard of honour for her. She was undergoing treatment for debility throughout. There was also something else, which she continued to do for years afterwards, and which almost nobody knew about at the time. Letters arrived at a considerable rate from the families of the nurses who had not come back, from parents and sisters and fiancés who wanted one specific thing, which was to be told that their daughter had behaved bravely in her dreadful ordeal. She answered every one of them personally. She told them what they needed to hear. She had been ordered to leave one part of it out. On the 11th of April, 1946, her account of the massacre at Radji Beach was tabled in federal parliament as part of the War Crimes Report, and the country read a version of it. That version had been settled some months earlier, and it concerned a document she had already signed. On the 20th of October, 1945, while she was still recovering, Bullwinkel gave the Australian war crimes investigators a sworn statement setting out what had happened on that beach. It was a complete account. It included what had been done to the nurses in the interval between the killing of the men and the killing of the women, which she alone among the living had witnessed, and it was graphic. It went into a file marked highly secretive, and it stayed there. We know what was in it because of a recorded interview given decades afterwards by Francis Hughes, one of the officers who investigated Japanese war crimes after the surrender, and located by Silver in the Australians at War Film Archive at the University of New South Wales. Hughes said that they had an affidavit from Vivian Bullwinkel, which was highly secretive, and that she was the only one apart from the Japanese who would have known of the mistreatment that those girls suffered. He then explained the decision in the plainest terms available. It was their maltreatment that was not to be revealed, he said, because it was so shocking that the government felt that their relatives should not be burdened by that knowledge. And Vivian Bullwinkel stayed with that. The nurses were raped before they were shot. That is the substance of what she reported and what was suppressed. And this account is not going to reconstruct it, describe it, or dramatize it, because the evidence establishes that it happened, and everything beyond that belongs to the women it happened to. What this account will do is follow what the Australian government and the Australian Army did with the information. That is a matter of public conduct. It is on the record. She was ordered not to speak of it. As a serving officer, she was bound by that order, and she kept it. The stated reason was compassion, and it should be taken seriously as a reason. In 1945, rape carried a stigma that attached itself to the victim, and senior officers took the view that families already absorbing the murder of a daughter should not be handed the rest of it. Silver's argument is that compassion was not the only thing operating, and that an institution which had known what the 229th Regiment did at Hong Kong, and had not hurried, had reasons of its own for preferring that the full circumstances of Radji Beach not be examined too closely. That is an argument rather than a finding. It is also difficult to dismiss. She arrived in Japan on the 31st of October, 1946, attached for duty with the 2nd Australian War Crimes Section in Tokyo, and in December she gave evidence before the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, and she was described as a model witness. She told the tribunal about the ship and the beach, and the line of women and the machine gun, and she told it about going into the jungle and lying down and either sleeping or being unconscious for a couple of days. Every word of it was true. It was also, in one specific and enormous respect, incomplete. She knew that while she was saying it. She said it anyway. She could not face staying on in Japan with the British Commonwealth Occupation Force, and returned to Australia in January 1947, and went back to nursing civilians. Nobody was ever punished for the massacre at Radji Beach. The unit was the 229th Infantry Regiment, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Iwabuchi, and Iwabuchi and his immediate subordinates were killed later in the war, in a regiment that was heavily engaged against Australian and American forces and suffered accordingly. Most of the men who stood on that beach were dead before anybody could ask them anything. Australian war crimes investigators identified 3 survivors as suspects: Captain Masaru Orita, Lieutenant Masayuki Takeuchi, and Sergeant Major Taro Kato, who had commanded a platoon present at Radji Beach. Takeuchi was detained in Malaya. Kato was detained in New Guinea. Neither of them was tried for what happened on that beach. Orita had been promoted to major and transferred to Manchuria to fight the Soviet Union. And when Australian investigators went looking for him, they could not find him in any Soviet prisoner of war camp. He was eventually traced to a stockade in Siberia and extradited to Sugamo Prison in Tokyo in 1948. And on the 11th of September of that year, 2 days after he was admitted, and before a single question had been put to him, he took his own life in his cell. There is a 15-year sentence that circulates in accounts of this story, and it belongs somewhere else. Captain Seki Kazue, the man who stood on the table and announced the end of the war without saying who had won it, was sentenced to 15 years by a war crimes tribunal at Medan in 1948 for the harsh treatment of internees in the camps he commanded. He was not at Radji Beach, and he had nothing to do with the killings. Different man, different crime, and the confusion has had the effect of making the record look less empty than it is. The regiment had done it before. 8 weeks before Radji Beach, in the last days of December 1941, the same 229th Infantry Regiment had raped and murdered British and Chinese nurses at Hong Kong, and the British had identified them for it. Which means that the decision taken in 1945 to spare the families the details and to close the file on what happened in the interval was also a decision about which pattern would not be traced and which questions would not be asked. According to the Australian government, the perpetrators of the massacre at Radji Beach remain unknown and escaped any punishment for their crime. That is where the matter rested for 45 years, and it began to come apart in an officers' mess. In 1991, at the Lewin Officers' Mess in Fremantle, an army captain named Patricia Hinks fell into conversation with Bullwinkel and asked her about a biography then in preparation and when it would be published. Bullwinkel said that she did not know, that she was waiting for them to print the truth, and that they would not print the truth. Hinks asked her what the truth was. Bullwinkel told her that they had been tortured and raped before being walked out to sea and shot. Hinks was so shocked that she did not ask a single further question. It is worth pausing here to note that the claim was already in the public domain. In September 1993, the Canberra Times reported a Japanese researcher's conclusion that the nurses massacred at Bangka Island had almost certainly been raped before they were killed, which is 26 years before the same claim was carried around the world by the international press as a revelation. The silence around Radji Beach was not maintained solely by an order given in 1945. It was maintained for decades afterwards by everybody's collective preference for the version that was easier to look at. 3 women took it apart. Tess Lawrence, a broadcaster and journalist, in whom Bullwinkel confided before her death that most of the nurses had been violated, and who published that in 2017, and who recorded Bullwinkel saying that the secret had tortured her. Barbara Angel, a biographer who did the forensic work, and Lynette Ramsey Silver, the military historian who assembled the whole of it and published it. Angel's contribution is the thing in this story that will not leave you alone. Bullwinkel donated the grey uniform dress she had been wearing on Radji Beach to the Australian War Memorial in December 1981, and it has been on public display in the Second World War Gallery ever since, with the bullet hole visible above the waistband. Angel examined it. She found that buttons had been torn off the bodice and afterwards sewn back on in a different colour thread. And she found that the entry and exit holes made by the bullet only line up with one another if the bodice was open at the waist and pulled down at the front. The object in the display case in Canberra, which several million people have now walked past, is not only a relic. It is physical evidence in an investigation that was never opened. There is more of it. An Australian investigating officer took a statement from a Japanese soldier who had been under treatment for malaria near the beach, who said that he had heard screaming and had been told that soldiers were on the beach and that the next platoon would have its turn. Silver also found that a quarter of a page had been removed with scissors from the personal account written by Jean Williams, the wife of Major Harold Williams of the Australian War Crimes Section, at precisely the point where it dealt with the fate of the nurses. A quarter of a page, taken out with scissors. Professor Peter Stanley of the University of New South Wales, one of the country's most senior military historians, said, when the story broke, that he had been waiting for it to come out, that it had been alleged for years, including by ex-servicewomen who had known Bullwinkel personally and had told him so, and that it correlated with documented sexual assaults by Japanese troops at Hong Kong, in the Philippines and in Singapore. The Japanese historian Yuki Tanaka, reading Bullwinkel's tribunal testimony, found it strange for a technical reason. She had described the Japanese separating the men from the women, and the separation of men from women was the standard precursor to exactly what her testimony did not mention. The Australian War Memorial's position, given by its director in 2019, was that they did not deny or downplay the allegations, that it is known that rape and sexual assault are used as weapons in war, but that as the sole survivor of the incident had died nearly 20 years earlier, they did not and could never categorically know what took place. Every clause of that is defensible. It is at the same time a precise description of what the order given in 1946 was always going to achieve. Asked in 2019 whether the new material would trigger a fresh investigation, a spokesperson for the Australian Defence Force said that the decision was one for government and noted that new historic allegations could be reported by family members to the unit that handles such matters. No new investigation has been announced. The people who would have had to report the allegation are the descendants of women killed 84 years ago. The last person who could have given evidence died in 2000. Something has shifted inside the institutions all the same. Speaking to the national broadcaster in 2026, Group Captain Kath Stein of the Department of Defence put the position in terms that would have been unimaginable from a serving officer in 1946. If history uncovers something uncomfortable, she said, we need to have the courage to engage with it and accept truth and facts and sit with that. It is not an apology, and it is not a finding. It is an acknowledgement that the thing was buried, offered by the successor of the organisation that buried it, which is not nothing. One further thing has been questioned, and it is the line everybody knows. In June 2026, the Australian Broadcasting Corporation devoted a documentary to Radji Beach and gave it the title The Myth of the Nurses on the Beach, and the myth in question was chin-up girls. The quotation exists in at least 4 materially different published versions. Some shouted, some whispered, some considerably longer, which is the ordinary signature of a phrase reconstructed rather than recorded. Georgina Banks, whose great-aunt's sister Dorothy Elmies died in that line, put the problem better than any historian has. We want our myths, she said, because they provide some solace, and nobody is trying to take that image away from anyone. It is absolutely fine to remember the nurses walking into the water with their heads held high. It is also really important to know what actually happened. Vivian Bullwinkel lived for another 53 years and did a great deal with them. She worked as a charge sister and then assistant matron at the Repatriation General Hospital at Heidelberg, and from 1961 until 1977, she was matron and director of nursing at the Fairfield Infectious Diseases Hospital in Melbourne. She was awarded the Florence Nightingale Medal by the International Red Cross in 1947, returned to uniform in the Citizen Military Forces, was confirmed in the rank of Lieutenant Colonel in 1963, and commanded a nursing corps training unit until 1970. Between 1964 and 1969, she was a trustee of the Australian War Memorial, the first woman ever appointed to that role. She was president of the Australian College of Nursing. She was appointed a member of the Order of the British Empire in 1973 and made an officer of the Order of Australia 20 years after that. Through 1947, she and Betty Jeffrey drove around Victoria, raising money for a memorial to the nurses who had died. The Australian Nurses Memorial Centre opened on St Kilda Road in Melbourne in 1950, with Bullwinkel as its inaugural vice president and Jeffrey running it. In 1954, Betty Jeffrey published White Coolies, and Jessie Simons published While History Passed, and both books sold heavily. And Australia learned this story from the women it had happened to. That is the fact that gives the suppression its real shape. The story of the Vyner Brooke and Radji Beach was not neglected, or forgotten, or left to specialists. It was told loudly, in the survivor's own words, to a large and attentive national audience for the next 7 decades. And the version that was told was the version with the middle cut out of it, because the one woman who could have supplied the rest had been ordered not to, and she was still keeping that order. Her closest friend's book was in every library in the country. In 1975, at the age of 59, Bullwinkel organised and led the nursing team that flew to Saigon on the second airlift of Operation Babylift and received the Vietnamese orphans at her own hospital. She married Colonel Francis Statham in 1977, moved to Perth, and was rigorous for the rest of her life about being addressed by her married name. In March 1993, she went back to Radji Beach with 7 other former nurses of the service to dedicate a memorial built partly from stone taken out of the camp they had been held in. She died of cardiac arrest at Nedlands in Western Australia on the 3rd of July, 2000, aged 84. She was given a state funeral. The Bangka Day service has been held in South Australia on the Sunday closest to the 16th of February every year since 1955. The 12 nurses lost at sea and the 21 killed on the beach are commemorated by name on the Singapore Memorial at Kranji, and the 8 who died in the camps lie in the war cemetery at Jakarta. All 41 names are on the Roll of Honour in Canberra. The Australian College of Nursing is establishing a scholarship in the name of each of the 21. On the 2nd of August, 2023, a bronze sculpture of Lieutenant Colonel Vivian Bullwinkel by the artist Charles Robb was dedicated in the grounds of the Australian War Memorial. It is the first commemorative sculpture of a woman ever placed there, 81 years after Radji Beach. She stands in her working summer uniform with her hands gently clasped. Set into the ground at the base of it are 22 inlaid steel discs, one for each of the women who died in the water, arranged to reproduce the pattern of the stars that would have been above that beach on the night of the 16th of February, 1942. In 2024, a new federal electorate was created in Western Australia and named Bullwinkel. Objections were lodged on the reasonable ground that she had no particular connection to that part of the state, and an alternative name was put forward: Alma Beard, a Western Australian nurse who had died beside her in the same line of women in the same burst of fire. The Commission kept Bullwinkel on the ground that the naming of federal seats recognises the extent of a person's contribution to the country as a whole. At the federal election in May 2025, the seat was won by a nurse. Every year, on that beach, the descendants of the women who died there gather with the local people of Bangka Island, walk down into the shallows where the line of nurses stood, and throw flowers into the water. In 2026, Georgina Banks brought her 2 daughters, Scarlett and Freddie, who are now roughly the age their great-great-aunt was when she was killed on that sand. And it was jarring, Scarlett said afterwards, to be standing on a beach. That beautiful, knowing what had happened on it. Freddie made the observation that ought to close every account of this, and almost never does. It is easy, she said, to forget that Bud served and that Bud nursed on that beach, because what gets talked about is the end of her life, rather than what she did with it. Until the final moment, she was a nurse. They all were. Their names were Elaine Balfour Ogilvie, Alma Beard, Joyce Bridge, Florence Casson, Mary Cuthbertson, Irene Drummond, Dorothy Elmers, Lorna Fairweather, Peggy Farminer, Clarice Halligan, Nancy Harris, Minnie Hodgson, Ellen Keats, Janet Kerr, Mary McGlade, Kathleen Newse, Florence Salmon, Esther Stewart, Mona Tate, Rosetta White, Bessie Wilmot. The youngest of them was 26 years old, and the eldest was 39. Vivian Bullwinkel died in July 2000. The only person alive who could have been asked a direct question about what happened on Radji Beach had been dead for 19 years by the time the evidence was assembled and published. And when the institution holding her uniform said that it could never categorically know what took place, it was telling the exact truth. That outcome was not an accident of mortality. It was the intended and foreseeable result of an instruction issued to a serving officer in 1946. And it worked. None of the women on that beach made a single decision that anyone has ever criticized. They declined to volunteer for evacuation because it meant leaving patients. They stayed with the stretcher cases when the civilians walked away. They put up a red cross where it could be seen. They linked arms. Every decision taken about them afterwards was taken by other people, in other rooms, at other ranks, and every one of those decisions went the same way. That distance is where the real history of this is written. Pearl Mittelhäuser never heard her own people call her by her first name. Kathleen Noyce never got to wear the shoes her sister sent. Bud Elmers's letters sat in a rattan box until her sister was dying and finally handed them on. The 22nd woman in that line has no name in any record that anyone has been able to find. And Vivian Bullwinkel, who was shot in the back at the age of 26 and hid the wound from her captors for 3.5 years so that someone would live to tell it, kept her word to the Australian Army for 54 years. She took the rest of it with her. The uniform is still in the case in Canberra. The holes still do not line up any other way. If you think these women deserve to be remembered by name, leave a comment below. And if you want to understand how the things armies decide their own people are allowed to know go on shaping a country for generations afterwards, watch this next.